The ballroom smelled like money and expectation, a particular scent I'd learned to recognize but never quite got used to, something between fresh-cut flowers and the faint chemical sweetness of high-end furniture polish. I sat at a table near the perimeter, one of the arrangement's careful accidents, far enough from the stage that I could observe without being observed, close enough that my absence from the moment would eventually register on someone's checklist. My dress was navy, tailored, expensive in a way that announced competence rather than celebration. It was the kind of dress I wore to board meetings and congressional testimonies, and wearing it here, in the ballroom of the Fairmont Grand in Houston, felt like showing up to a wedding in a business suit, technically appropriate, fundamentally misaligned with the occasion's true purpose. My father's retirement gala was in full swing. The room held roughly 400 people, a cross-section of the American industrial establishment, executives from Fortune 500 companies, politicians seeking favorable coverage in the business press, retired military brass with consulting contracts, journalists who covered the economy beat. The kind of room where my father had lived his entire adult life, and where I had never quite fit, despite my own accomplishments, or perhaps because of them. Thomas Brooks was giving his speech now, standing at the podium beneath lights that made his silver hair gleam like a stage prop. He was 72, tall, with the bearing of someone who had spent 50 years being listened to without interruption. His voice carried that particular blend of gravitas and warmth that came from decades of practice, the tone of a man accustomed to being taken seriously, even when discussing trivial matters. The room was utterly silent. People liked this commanded silence the way other people commanded respect. They were the same thing in his presence. "I've been blessed," he began, which was the opening line of a script I'd heard variants of before, at corporate dinners, at industry conferences, at the country club where he'd been a member for 30 years. Blessed with a career that mattered. Blessed with a family that supported me. And blessed with work that I still believe, even now, shaped something real in this country. The applause was immediate and sustained. I watched the people around me join in, genuine, mostly, with only a few performative exceptions. They believed what my father had just told them. Why wouldn't they? He had built plants that employed thousands. He had testified before Congress about American manufacturing. His decisions had moved markets. His absence from the landscape would, in some small way, diminish it. But let me tell you about the real architects of any success, he continued, and I felt something shift in my chest, a small tightening that I recognized as something between hope and dread. The people who stand beside you. Who believe in you when the work is hardest. Who understand what it means to build something that lasts. He turned to indicate Michael, my eldest brother, sitting in the front row with his wife Sarah. Michael was in his dress uniform, Air Force Blues, though he was only here for the weekend. He'd been stationed at Nellis for the past 3 years, rising through ranks that somehow made sense to everyone in this room, following a trajectory that my father understood with the same clarity that he understood quarterly earnings and supply chain management. Michael stood, acknowledged the applause with a modest nod, the posture of someone already practiced at being admired. My son, a decorated officer. A man of honor. My father's voice carried genuine pride. The kind of man who makes you believe in institutions. Then he mentioned Andrew, my middle brother, who worked in senior management at an energy corporation. Andrew also stood, also received applause, his achievement framed in the language of infrastructure and growth, the kind of thing my father could discuss with ease at cocktail parties. The applause for Andrew was slightly less sustained than it had been for Michael, but that was only because the room had begun the descent into the inevitable moment when everyone starts checking their phones and calculating how soon they can leave. I waited. The script I'd heard my entire life had room for me, usually a line, sometimes not even that much. I'd learned not to expect more. Expectation was a kind of violence you inflicted on yourself. And my daughter, Evelyn, my father said, finally, and I straightened in my chair despite myself. She works with computers. very accomplished in her way. The words landed like a particular kind of silence, not empty, but full. Full of the unsaid architecture of how my father sorted the world. There was real work and then there was everything else. There was building things and then there was data, information systems, research infrastructure, the invisible scaffolding that made other people's real work possible, but not quite real itself. We're very proud of her, he added, which completed the sentence and the dismissal in a single gentle motion. The audience nodded, as though this matter had been thoroughly established and could now be moved past. I watched a woman at a nearby table lean toward her companion and mouth something I couldn't hear, likely an excuse for why she didn't recognize the name. There was, in her expression, the particular kindness that came from not finding you threatening or worth the cognitive effort to remember. I did not clap for myself. I had learned, somewhere between childhood and now, that self-congratulation on the basis of a dismissal was its own form of invisibility. Better to be silent and observe. Better to be small and complete. Better to build something that didn't require being seen to matter. My father continued with anecdotes, stories about plants he'd opened, markets he'd navigated, principles he'd lived by. Stories that were, to be fair, interesting. He was a good speaker, skilled at finding the human moment within the large-scale decision. He told the one about the plant closure in Ohio in 2008, how it had kept him awake at night, how he'd ensured severance packages were generous, how he believed that capitalism had obligations beyond the shareholder. The room loved this story. It positioned him as both a titan of industry and a man of conscience, a difficult balance that he'd somehow managed to maintain through the force of his own conviction. A slideshow began, photographs from his career, projected onto a screen behind the podium. There was my father with presidents. My father with senators. My father in hard hat at a plant opening, shaking hands with union representatives. A photograph of him receiving an award from the Chamber of Commerce. Another with him at some international conference, looking powerful and comfortable in every currency. The photos told a story of relentless ascension, each frame another rung on a ladder that had never seemed to stop. In the middle of the slideshow, there were family photos. My father with Michael at his commissioning ceremony, both of them in uniform despite the fact that my father had never served. My father with Andrew at some corporate event, the two of them in conversation with someone who looked important. My father with my mother, Linda, at what looked like a gala much like this one, though from years ago, when she still seemed surprised to be standing beside him. I was not in any of the family photos. Not in a single frame. It wasn't a conspiracy, I simply hadn't been there for most of these moments, and in the ones where I had been present, I hadn't fit the visual narrative my father wanted to tell. I was at MIT, not standing beside him at events. I was in California, not attending corporate dinners. I was building things in laboratories and server rooms that existed in spaces that didn't photograph well, achievements that required context and explanation, the kind of thing that demanded more from a viewer than a simple moment of recognition. I watched my father's face as the photos cycled past. He looked satisfied. Not smug, exactly. He was too intelligent and too practiced to be smug. But satisfied in the way of someone who has told a story that satisfies him, who has arranged the evidence of his life into a narrative that confirms his sense of how things actually work, what actually matters, who actually counts. It was only when the slideshow ended that I noticed, in the back of my purse, the small wrapped box I had brought. I'd been holding onto it for months, wrapped in craft paper with a single piece of string, something I'd prepared not quite knowing when or if I'd have the courage to give it. The box contained something from my childhood, a preserved artifact of the last moment my father had looked at me with uncomplicated pride. I was 9 years old. It was the science fair at my elementary school, held in the gymnasium on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I had built a working model of a hydroelectric dam out of cardboard and plastic tubing, with a small water pump that actually generated electricity using the flow of water. I'd spent weeks on it, and I understood, even then, that I'd made something that was technically sophisticated beyond what other 9-year-olds were expected to create. My father arrived late. He'd had to come straight from some work obligation, but when he saw my project, something shifted in his face. He asked me detailed questions about the mechanics. He understood the engineering immediately. He looked at me like I was someone he recognized. I won the fair. There was a blue ribbon, and a small trophy, and a certificate. My father took photographs. He told me I was brilliant. He looked at me the way he looked at himself in the mirror, like someone looking at a future that was already written, assured and bright. But the next year, I wanted to keep building. I started reading engineering texts beyond my grade level. I filled notebooks with sketches of systems and mechanisms. I pestered my father with questions about industrial processes, about how complex machines actually worked. And somewhere in that period, between the moment of his pride and the years that followed, something changed. The questions began to feel like an indulgence rather than a promise. The ambition began to read differently, not as talent, but as intensity, as something that might need to be tempered or redirected. My mother started suggesting I try dance class. My father began to work later, to have less time for the detailed conversations we used to have. By the time I was 13, I understood, without anyone ever explicitly saying so, that my brilliance was acceptable only insofar as it didn't interfere with the more important business of becoming an appropriately adjusted girl. I was smart, but not the kind of smart that was a calling. That was the kind of smart that was a problem. I'd kept the blue ribbon from the science fair. I'd pressed it between pages of a book and carried it with me through college, through graduate school, through the early years of my career. Every time I moved to a new apartment, I'd find it in some box, surprised each time by how little it weighed, how easily it could be lost or forgotten. A few years ago, I decided to preserve it properly, framed it with a photograph my father had taken, with the handwritten label from the entry form, with a few lines of text that I'd written myself, trying to capture what I remembered of that moment. I'd wrapped it and, in moments of weakness or perhaps courage, carried it to things like this. The applause for my father continued around me. The room was standing now, a standing ovation, which felt excessive until I remembered that standing ovations for successful men who had just retired were not actually about the quality of the speech or the depth of the gratitude. They were ritual, a particular kind of social choreography that acknowledged both that a man had been powerful and that he was now leaving, which meant you could finally relax. I stood also. I applauded. I did this the way I did most things, correctly, appropriately, exactly as I was expected to do. I had become expert at this, at finding the right tone, the right gesture, the right moment of engagement and withdrawal that allowed me to exist in rooms like this without drawing attention to the fact that I didn't belong, that I was only here because I shared his DNA and he was my father and this was what family did. But as the applause continued and my father moved through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting embraces, being photographed with various dignitaries and old friends, I felt something shift inside me. It was small and quiet, barely articulated even to myself, but it was there. A kind of exhaustion, but also a kind of clarity. The same clarity I experienced when I was working on something important, when I was in a lab or a secure facility at the research center, when I was solving problems that mattered and wouldn't be solved if I didn't do them. The clarity of someone who understood, with precision, what was being asked of her and what she was capable of delivering. I stood up. I walked toward the podium. It took longer than I thought it would. The ballroom was crowded now, the evening program transitioning into the cocktail portion, people moving between conversations and bars and small moments of connection. No one seemed to notice or care that I was walking forward with intention. I was just another person moving through space, and that invisibility, which I'd grown accustomed to treating as a kind of wound, suddenly felt like an advantage. When I reached the podium, I turned on the microphone. The gesture was so simple and so presumptuous that for a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the conversations around me began to quiet. People turned. My father, who was in the middle of a conversation with someone I recognized as a state senator, stopped mid-sentence. His expression shifted into something between confusion and something else, something sharper. Recognition, perhaps, of the fact that a line had been crossed. "Hello," I said. My voice sounded strange coming through the speakers, amplified and present in a way I didn't entirely recognize. "I'm Evelyn Brooks." My father just spoke about his career and his family. I want to add something. My father had begun to move toward the stage, but slowly, as though he wasn't quite sure what was happening. My mother, sitting in the front row near my brothers, had gone very still. Michael looked embarrassed. Andrew looked curious. My father looked, I thought, afraid, which was an emotion I'd seen rarely enough that I almost didn't recognize it. When I was 9 years old, I said, I built something. It wasn't anything world-changing. It was a model of a hydroelectric dam made out of cardboard and plastic. But I built it because I understood how things worked, because I could see the relationship between problems and solutions. My father came to the science fair, and he looked at what I'd built, and he was proud of me. I reached into my bag and pulled out the framed artifact. The blue ribbon, the photograph, the certificate. Even from a distance, I could see my father's face change, a flush of color moving up his neck, a particular tightening around his mouth. He told me I was brilliant, I continued, and my voice remained steady, which I was grateful for. He meant it. He understood, in that moment, that I had a gift for understanding complex systems. That I had a capacity for building things that worked. That I had a mind that functioned at a particular level of sophistication. I paused. The room was utterly silent now. Even the staff had stopped moving, waiters frozen mid-gesture, suspended in the moment of a daughter speaking at her father's retirement gala in a way that was clearly not part of the program. "That blue ribbon," I said, is one of the last times my father looked at me as though my intelligence was an asset rather than an inconvenience. After that, the message became clearer. My brother's accomplishments made sense. They served the country, they built infrastructure, they did things that men like my father could understand and respect. But my work was something else. It was too abstract, too technical, too unmarked by the kind of public recognition that meant something to him. I set the framed artifact on the podium. My hands were steady. This was one of the things I'd learned in my career, how to stay calm in a crisis, how to deliver difficult information without flinching, how to present truth in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. I'm the Director of Advanced Systems Analysis at the Aerospace Technology Research Institute, I said. For those of you who may not be familiar with ATRI, we are a federal research center with an annual budget of approximately $3 billion. We employ over 3,000 scientists, engineers, and technicians. Our work spans from fundamental research in materials science and aerospace engineering to classified research for the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. I saw recognition flicker across some faces in the room. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that my father's dismissal was being recontextualized in real time, the invisible work suddenly acquiring borders and weight and name. I have been in this position for 8 years, I continued. In that time, I have overseen research teams that have contributed to 4 classified defense initiatives, 2 significant advances in propulsion technology, and 1 breakthrough in materials that has applications across aerospace, automotive, and renewable energy sectors. I have testified before Congress. I have published in peer-reviewed journals. I have built an institute that is recognized internationally as the preeminent research center in my field. My father's face had gone pale. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite parse, not anger, not shame, but something closer to vertigo, the look of someone whose sense of how the world was ordered had just shifted beneath him. "The reason you didn't recognize my name," I said, not unkindly, "is that this kind of work doesn't get written about in the newspapers you read. It happens in places most people will never go. It's funded through channels that aren't discussed at cocktail parties. It doesn't come with photo opportunities or speaking engagements or the kind of visibility that translates into prestige in rooms like this. But it matters. Considerably. And the reason I'm telling you all of this isn't to humiliate my father or to compete with his achievements. It's to say that I have spent my adult life building something real, and the fact that it wasn't recognized or understood by the people who were supposed to know me best has never actually changed whether the work was real or not." I picked up the framed ribbon. "This means something," I said. This moment when my father recognized my gifts meant something. But I want to be clear about something else. I didn't need this recognition to know what I was capable of. I didn't need my family to understand my work to know that it mattered. I would have built it anyway. I have built it anyway. And I will keep building it whether or not anyone in this room ever believes that what I do is as important as my father's career." There was a moment of complete silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a man stood. He was in his 60s, grey-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. I recognized him as Dr. Marcus Chen, the president of the American Aerospace Society and a figure of considerable prominence in research circles. He began to applaud. The applause spread slowly, then quickly, then with something that felt like inevitability. My father stood also, though his applause seemed uncertain, almost mechanical. My brothers clapped. My mother clapped with tears on her face, not sadness, I thought, but something closer to relief. I stepped away from the podium. I set the framed ribbon carefully on the table beside it, where someone would find it and where it would eventually make its way back to me. I walked back through the crowd, and people's eyes followed me this time, not with judgment but with something closer to recognition. When I reached my table, I gathered my purse and my jacket. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I simply left, walking out of the ballroom and into the Houston evening, where the air was warm and humid and smelled like rain. The drive back to my hotel took about 15 minutes. I sat in the car with my hands on the steering wheel, not driving, processing the magnitude of what I had just done. I had, in the presence of 400 important people, publicly corrected my father's characterization of my work. I had not been angry. I had not been theatrical. I had simply been truthful. And the truth had shifted something in the room. In my family's perception, in the narrative my father had spent a lifetime constructing about how the world actually worked and who in it actually mattered. By the time I reached my hotel room, my phone had already begun to buzz with messages. Michael had texted, "That took real courage." "I'm sorry. Andrew, I didn't realize what you actually did. That was impressive." My mother had called twice and left messages both times, asking if I was okay, if I wanted to talk. I didn't respond to any of them. Not yet. I needed to sit with this first, to understand what I'd done and what it meant before I tried to explain it to anyone else. I ordered room service and poured a glass of wine. I sat on the balcony of my hotel room, looking out at the Houston skyline, and I let myself feel what I was feeling, which was a complicated mixture of relief and sadness and a kind of grief for all the years I'd learned to make myself smaller than I actually was. 2 weeks later, I was back in California, back at the ATRI facility in Mountain View, back in the world where I actually belonged. The research center occupied a sprawling campus in the heart of Silicon Valley, a place of low buildings and glass and the particular aesthetic that emerged when government met technology. I'd worked here for a long time, and it had become, over the years, far more of a home than I'd ever felt in my actual house. I had a corner office on the 3rd floor with windows that looked out onto the campus grounds. The walls were lined with the things that actually marked my life, not family photographs, but framed covers of scientific journals with my name on them, awards from various research organizations, photographs from conferences where I delivered keynote presentations, a signed letter from the director of the National Science Foundation, plaques commemorating various research initiatives I'd led. When I'd first set up this office, the decision not to include family photos had felt deliberate, almost defiant. But the truth was more subtle than that. The truth was that the family I'd come from had never quite known how to see the person I'd become. My actual life, the one that mattered, that had substance and weight and real consequence, existed in a space where they couldn't follow me. And so I'd built a space that reflected that reality. A space where I wasn't anyone's daughter or sister. I was just myself, in full. The morning after the gala, I'd sent my father an email, simple and direct, with links to papers I'd published, to the ATRI website, to the congressional testimony I'd given. I didn't say anything caustic or pointed. I simply provided the information that would allow him to actually understand what his daughter did for a living. I didn't expect him to read it all. I expected him to read enough. 3 weeks passed. I threw myself into work, which was always where I was most comfortable. We were in the middle of a critical research initiative examining long-range propulsion systems for next-generation spacecraft. The work was technically complex and intellectually engaging, the kind of thing that made days pass in a kind of flow state where I forgot about everything outside the problem I was solving. Daniel Reed, my deputy director, noticed the shift in my energy. Daniel was in his early 50s, brilliant in the particular way that came from decades of serious technical work, and he'd been one of my first real allies when I'd stepped into this position. He understood, without explanation, what I was carrying, and he'd learned not to ask directly but to simply make space for me to work through whatever was happening. "Good work on the velocity calculations," he said one afternoon, reviewing data I'd generated. "This is going to move the timeline forward significantly." "Thanks," I said. I needed to focus on something clear. He nodded. He didn't ask about the gala, though I suspected he knew it had happened. He simply made a cup of tea and left it on my desk, a small gesture of the kind that Daniel was good at. It was nearly a month after the gala when the letter arrived. I knew what it was the moment I saw it, my father's handwriting on the envelope. The particular blue-black ink he'd used for decades, the formal address of my work office. Most people would have sent something more casual, an email or text message. But my father, despite his many modern accomplishments, retained certain reflexes from an older era. Important things were communicated on paper. I opened it in my office, alone. The letter was long, which was unusual for him. He wasn't naturally verbose. He was a man of short, direct sentences that landed like statements of fact. "Evelyn," it began, "I owe you an apology. I've read the materials you sent. I've looked into your position and your accomplishments. I have to tell you that I didn't understand, and rather than take the time to understand, I chose not to look very closely. That was a failure on my part, and not a small one." I stopped reading for a moment. I held the letter away from me, as though the paper itself might change if I looked at it from a different angle. "Your mother told me something," the letter continued, "that I've been thinking about since. She said that when you were 10 or 11, you asked me questions about systems architecture, and I told you that it was too dry and suggested you try something else. I don't remember this conversation, which is somehow worse than if I did. I don't remember the moment when I told my brilliant daughter that her interests were somehow less valid than those of her brothers. But your mother remembers. And now I'm trying to understand what I was thinking, and I can't find an answer that makes me feel less ashamed of myself." The letter continued for another page. It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the kind of apology that came from a person naturally gifted at emotional expression. But it was honest in a way that my father rarely was, which made it, in its way, remarkable. I want you to know that you were right, he wrote. What you do is real. What you've accomplished is impressive by any measure, and the fact that I didn't recognize it says something about the limitations of my own perspective, not about the value of your work. I'm trying to do better. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm aware of how much I got wrong. The letter ended with his signature, just his name, no closing sentiment, no I love you. But the absence of those things felt appropriate. My father wasn't someone who traded easily in sentiment. The apology itself was the sentiment, clear and measured and as much as he could manage. I set the letter down on my desk and let myself feel what I was feeling. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. Forgiveness implies returning to a state of trust, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was his presence in the space of what he'd done, rather than his absence. I called my mother that evening. Did you tell him? I asked. Yes, she said quietly. I told him he'd failed you. I should have done it sooner, Evelyn. I should have said something when it was happening. You're saying it now, I said. I know it's not enough, she said. No, I said. It's not enough. But it's something. The family dinner happened in October, 3 months after the Gala. It took place at the house I'd grown up in, a large contemporary home in the suburbs of Houston, the kind of place that had been decorated by a professional and maintained by a staff, which meant it never quite felt like anyone actually lived there. My parents had rattled around in it for years after Michael and Andrew and I had left. It was too big, too formal, too much a monument to my father's success and not enough a space where people actually sat and talked. But this was where my family gathered, and so this was where we had our dinner. I arrived by car from the airport, driving through streets that still remembered from my childhood, finding the neurological pathways that had been carved into me by years of driving from school to home, from home to the country club. The house looked exactly as it always did, which was somehow more disorienting than if it had changed. Time passed, I moved through the world, I built things and grew and became someone entirely different. And this house remained static, a kind of museum to a version of myself that had never actually existed, preserved in beige carpet and tasteful art and the particular smell of a home that had been professionally cleaned. My mother answered the door. She looked smaller than I remembered her, which was a strange observation since I'd seen her relatively recently, but it was true. The years had compressed her somehow, made her seem less substantial. She embraced me tightly, and I felt something catch in my chest, not quite forgiveness, but a kind of tenderness that I hadn't been able to access before. Come in, she said. Everyone's here. My father was in the living room, standing near the window. Michael and Sarah were there, Sarah sitting on the couch with a drink in her hand. Andrew had brought his wife, Jennifer, who I saw infrequently and with whom I had maintained the cordial distance that often characterizes relationships between in-laws who don't share much common ground beyond the fact of shared family. My father turned when I entered the room. There was a moment of awkwardness, the particular tension that emerges when a family hasn't resolved something but has decided, collectively, that they need to try. He stepped forward and extended his hand, which was a Thomas Brooks kind of move, formal, restrained, the gesture of a man who wasn't naturally comfortable with displays of emotion but was attempting to make one anyway. I shook his hand. We didn't hug. We didn't know each other well enough for that. I'm glad you came, he said. I said I would, I said. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the table set with the china that my mother brought out for occasions, the kind of place settings that seemed designed to create distance rather than connection. We ate a salmon that had been prepared by a caterer, dressed in some kind of herb-infused sauce that was perfectly executed and utterly forgettable. For the first part of the meal, the conversation was careful and light, discussion of my brother's work, talk about Michael's potential next posting, Questions about a renovation Andrew was planning on his house in Dallas. These were the conversations my family had learned to have, the safe channels through which connection could flow without requiring vulnerability. Somewhere through the second course, my father set down his fork and looked directly at me. "I've been reading about your work," he said. "The materials you sent. I went to the ATRI website. I watched a recording of your congressional testimony from last year." The table went quiet. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, whether they acknowledged it or not. "It's impressive," he continued. "It's sophisticated in ways that I'm not sure I fully understand, but I can see the caliber of what you're doing. I can see that you're leading something significant." "Yes," I said. "I am." "I was wrong," he said, and his voice had taken on the particular tone that emerged when he was deliberately saying something that didn't come naturally to him. "I was wrong to minimize your work. I was wrong to make you feel like what you were doing wasn't real or wasn't as important as what your brothers were doing. I chose not to understand because I think I was afraid of not being relevant. If you were brilliant in ways I couldn't understand, then I couldn't advise you or guide you. And I preferred not being able to understand to admitting that I was afraid." Michael set down his drink. Andrew looked at his plate. My mother reached over and squeezed my father's hand. "I don't expect this to fix things," and my father continued. "I know there's a lot of history here, a lot of years where I got it wrong. But I want you to know that I understand now, and I'm sorry. And I'm proud of you. I should have been proud of you a long time ago." I took a sip of water. I was quiet for a moment, letting the statement settle into the air between us. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "I do. But I want to be clear about something, and I say this not as an accusation but as a boundary. I'm not going to perform gratitude for being finally recognized. You were wrong. That's established. The question now is what changes?" My father nodded slowly. "What changes?" he echoed. "I need to be treated as an adult who knows what she's doing," I said. "Not as a daughter who needs validation. I need my work to be taken seriously, not as a hobby or as something cute, but as what it actually is, a significant professional achievement. And I need my brothers to understand that my success isn't competitive with theirs. We're not in a hierarchy where one of us being successful diminishes the others. But in this family, that's how it's been structured. And that's got to change." Michael shifted in his seat. "I think we've all understood that," he said carefully, at least since the gala. "Understanding and doing are different things," I said. "I've spent my life in spaces where people actually know what I do. I've built a career around being competent and being respected for that competence. Coming back to this family, where I had to fight to be seen as real, that's been a particular kind of wound. And I'm not interested in leaving my career at the door every time I come home. I'm interested in being known as I actually am." My mother was crying quietly. Sarah reached over and put a hand on her arm. Andrew was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between recognition and something else, perhaps a kind of respect that he hadn't quite been able to access before the gala. "I can do that," and my father said. "I can try." "I know you can," I said. "The question is whether you will, consistently, over time, when it's not convenient." He nodded. "We didn't resolve it there, of course. You don't resolve decades of misunderstanding and emotional distance over dinner. But we acknowledged it, which was something. We named the territory we'd been in and agreed, at least tentatively, to inhabit different terrain. The rest of the dinner passed in a way that felt slightly different from how these gatherings usually went. There was still the formality, still the guardedness, but there was also something else, a kind of honesty that hadn't been present before. When Michael asked about my work, I answered not with the short, practical descriptions I usually offered, but with something more substantive. I talked about the research I was leading, about the problems we were trying to solve, about why this work mattered in the larger landscape of human knowledge and technological advancement. My father asked questions. Some of them he couldn't quite understand. I could see the moment when the technical concepts became too dense, when his mind reached the limit of what he could follow. But he asked anyway, and he listened, and that was a start. The international conference happened in Washington, D.C., in November. It was the annual meeting of the American Aerospace Society, held at a large hotel near the National Mall, which meant the structure of the conference was a kind of geography lesson in how the federal government actually worked, people moving between sessions and networking events, the particular constellation of power and knowledge that characterizes these kinds of gatherings. I'd been invited to deliver the keynote on the final day of the conference, a significant honor that still occasionally struck me as improbable, that an organization of this stature had asked me to stand before a crowd of prominent researchers and speak to the future of long-range propulsion systems and the philosophical questions embedded in how we imagine extended human presence in space. The night before the keynote, I got a phone call from my father. "I'm coming," he said. "Your mother and I. And your brothers are trying to see if they can make it as well. We want to hear you speak." I was startled. I'd never explicitly invited them, though I had mentioned the conference in passing. I hadn't expected them to actually show up, to make plans and travel to Washington, to sit in an audience and listen to me present work that was so far outside the realm of things they typically engaged with. "Okay," I said. That's fine. I'll arrange tickets." "We don't need tickets," my father said. "Just seats. We'll figure it out." The day of the keynote, I was in a state of unusual nervousness. I'd given dozens of public presentations. I'd testified before Congress. I was entirely comfortable speaking to audiences of experts and policymakers. But the idea of my family sitting in the audience, watching me work in the space where I was most fully myself, was somehow more unsettling than speaking to crowds of strangers. I went through the morning in a kind of calm focus. I reviewed my slides, checked my notes, did the things I did before any major presentation. The conference center was large, a kind of institutional space that had been designed to accommodate large gatherings, with high ceilings and good acoustics and the particular aesthetic of government buildings, professional, competent, utterly without charm. The keynote was scheduled for 2 o'clock. I arrived in the hall at 1:30 to do a technical check, to make sure my slides would project properly, to walk the stage and familiarize myself with the space I'd be occupying. As I was doing this, I saw them enter. My father and mother came first, my mother looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested she dressed up for the occasion in clothes that didn't quite fit her sense of herself. My father wore a suit, pressed and appropriate, the kind of thing he wore to important business events. Michael was in uniform, which had the effect of making him stand out slightly in the room, a marker of a different kind of authority. Andrew was there with Jennifer. And there was a moment where I watched them locate seats in the front row, where I would be able to see their faces as I spoke. I felt something shift inside me. I felt the weight of being seen by them, really seen, in the space where I was most genuinely myself. I went backstage. I took a few deep breaths. I grounded myself in the particular calm that came from knowing what you're about to do, from having prepared thoroughly, from understanding that you have something valuable to say. At 2 o'clock, I was introduced by the conference director. The introduction highlighted my credentials, my publications, my role at ATRI, my various honors and recognitions. It was a solid introduction, the kind that positioned me as exactly what I was, a significant voice in this field, someone worth listening to. I took the stage. The room held about 500 people. Researchers and engineers, policymakers and journalists, People from other countries who had come to understand what the American aerospace industry was thinking about its future. I could see my family in the front row. My father had his hands folded in his lap, looking directly at me. My mother was smiling slightly, nervously. Michael looked proud in a way that was undiluted by sibling competition. Andrew was leaning slightly forward, genuinely interested. "Good afternoon," EI said, and the words carried through the room with the weight of amplification. "I'm Evelyn Brooks, Director of Advanced Systems Analysis at the Aerospace Technology Research Institute. I want to talk to you today about something that I think is central to how we imagine the future of human space exploration, and that's the question of how we move beyond the constraints of our current propulsion paradigms." I clicked to my first slide, which showed a visual representation of current propulsion technologies: chemical, ion drive, nuclear thermal. Familiar territory, well understood, with clear limitations and capabilities. For the past 50 years, EI continued, our long-range space capabilities have been built around these three primary propulsion systems. They work. They've gotten us to the moon, they've sent rovers to Mars, they've positioned satellites throughout the solar system. They've given us an understanding of space that would have been impossible without them. And they are also fundamentally limiting us. They are limiting how far we can go, how fast we can travel, how long we can sustain human presence in deep space. I moved through my research. I showed data and visualizations and theoretical frameworks that demonstrated why current propulsion systems hit specific walls. Why the assumptions we'd made in the mid-20th century were increasingly inadequate for the work we wanted to do now. I talked about the research we were conducting, the teams I'd assembled, the theoretical breakthroughs that were beginning to emerge from laboratories around the world. But somewhere in the middle of my presentation, I deviated slightly from my prepared remarks. I'd planned to talk about the technical aspects of emerging propulsion technologies. Instead, I found myself speaking about something else. "There's something I want to address," EI said, "that isn't usually part of these conversations, but that I think is relevant. When we talk about long-range space exploration, we talk about vision. We talk about dreams and goals and the kind of work that pushes the boundaries of human capability. And those conversations are important. But there's another kind of work that I think gets less recognition, and I want to put that work into focus for a moment." I paused. I could see my father's expression change into something like curiosity. "The work of building infrastructure that makes those dreams possible," I continued. "The work of assembling teams and managing research across decades and maintaining focus when the end result might not be visible for years, might not even happen in my lifetime. The work of being a woman in a field that wasn't designed for women to occupy, of building a team that's diverse and brilliant, and of managing the particular tensions that come from trying to do excellent work in spaces that weren't built to accommodate everyone who wanted to do that work." I clicked to a new slide, not one I'd planned. It was a photograph of my team at ATRI, taken last year at a conference. Brilliant people, representing different nations, different genders, different career trajectories. All of them doing work that mattered, all of them invisible to most of the world. "I started this research program 8 years ago," EI said. "Many people didn't believe it was possible. Many people didn't think it was worth funding. I had to fight for resources, for attention, for the basic organizational infrastructure needed to do this work. I had to build something from nothing, and I had to do it in a space where my authority was constantly being questioned, where my leadership was being scrutinized in ways that my male colleagues didn't experience. I looked directly at my family. I had to do it without recognition from the people who were supposed to understand me best. I had to build it anyway, because the work itself was important enough. Not because anyone was applauding or validating me along the way, but because the problems I was trying to solve mattered. Because the systems I was trying to create mattered. Because the people on my team depended on me to create a space where their excellence could flourish." My voice had become quieter, more controlled, but it had also become more powerful. The room had gone very still. What I've learned, or I continued, is that recognition is wonderful. Being seen, being valued, being respected, those things matter. They matter a lot. But they're not the thing that makes the work real. The work is real because of what it does, not because of who sees it. And I think that's an important distinction to make in a field like ours, where we're often working on things that won't be implemented for years, that might not have visible results in our professional lifetimes, that might be the scaffolding for someone else's breakthrough. That's still valuable. That's still work that's worth doing. I ended my keynote with a call to action, to the institutions that funded research, to the leaders in the field, to the people training the next generation. I called on them to fund the unsexy work, the infrastructure work, the foundational research that wouldn't generate headlines but would make possible the breakthroughs that would. When I finished, the room erupted. Not just applause, which was expected, but the kind of standing ovation that came from people who had recognized something true in what I'd said. I watched audience members turning to each other, saw them nodding. Saw the acknowledgement that this had been a moment. I looked down at my family. My father was standing, applauding, and his expression was one I recognized. It was the expression he'd had at the science fair, years ago, when he'd looked at his brilliant daughter and seen something he recognized in himself, not competition, not threat, but kinship. The recognition of someone who could understand what excellence looked like, who could see the architecture underneath the surface. After the keynote, there was a reception. I moved through it the way I'd learned to, connecting with colleagues and peers, taking congratulations, answering questions about the research and the direction of future initiatives. My family stayed at the edge of the event, giving me space but remaining present. I could feel their attention on me, not in a claustrophobic way, but like a kind of witness to who I actually was. Toward the end of the reception, my father approached me. We stood together for a moment without speaking, both of us looking out at the room, at the collection of people and conversations and the particular energy that characterized the moment after a successful public event. "That was extraordinary," he said finally. "Thank you," I said. "I understood about a third of it," he added, with a hint of something that might have been humor. "But I understood the other part. The part about building without being seen." "Yes," I said. "I wonder," he said, "if that's something I should have understood sooner." "Maybe," I said. "But you're understanding it now." He nodded. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, a physical gesture that was as close as my father typically came to affection. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the thing that would undo years of being dismissed and minimized. But it was real. It was his presence in what I had become. My mother joined us, taking my hand. Michael came over, and we stood together as a family in that awkward constellation that comes when people aren't quite sure how to relate to each other but are committed to trying. Andrew and Jennifer stood nearby, giving us a respectful distance but remaining present. "I'm proud of you," my father said. And I believed him. The months that followed were, surprisingly, different. Not perfect. My family would never be the kind of family that operated on the basis of perfect understanding or deep emotional connection. But different. My father began, without being asked, to learn more about what I actually did. He didn't come to understand all of it, but he developed enough knowledge to have real conversations, to ask informed questions, to move beyond the dismissal and into something that looked like actual interest. I started a mentorship program at ATRI, working with young women in technical fields, helping them navigate the particular challenges that came from being brilliant in spaces that hadn't been designed with them in mind. I drew on everything I'd learned about perseverance, about building in the absence of external validation, about creating spaces where excellence could flourish without requiring constant recognition. My brothers began to reach out more regularly. Michael talked to me about decisions he was making in his military career, values questions that came up when you were in command of teams and responsible for lives. He still didn't fully understand what I did, but he respected it in a way that felt earned rather than performed. Andrew asked me to consult on a project he was working on, recognizing that my expertise in systems architecture might be valuable for a problem his company was trying to solve. I didn't move back to Texas. I didn't start spending every holiday with my family. I maintained the life I'd built in California, the career that mattered to me, the space where I was fully myself. But the family events that I did attend were characterized by a kind of ease that hadn't existed before, not forgetting the past, but no longer imprisoned by it. A year after the Washington conference, my father published a piece in the Harvard Business Review about innovation and the importance of creating spaces where diverse thinking could flourish. He didn't mention me directly, but I recognized the arc of what he was arguing, a narrative shift from the idea that achievement had to look a particular way to the recognition that excellence could take many forms, that there were multiple kinds of leadership and contribution that mattered. I was having coffee with Daniel one afternoon, reviewing some research results, when he mentioned that he'd seen my father's piece. "He writes well," Daniel said. "And he seems like he understands something about systems thinking." "His learning," I said. "There's something else," Daniel said. "The leadership development program I'm on requested you specifically as a speaker. They want you to talk about building teams and managing research in politically complex environments. They're interested in your perspective on what it takes to create excellence in institutional settings." "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I said you'd probably say yes," he said, "because you're someone who believes in the infrastructure work." But I said I'd ask. I thought about this. A year ago, I would have said no. A year ago, I'd been focused on the work itself, on the invisible architecture of my success. I'd built everything for the work, not for the recognition or the platform. But somewhere in the past year, something had shifted. Recognition wasn't making me smaller. It wasn't making me feel like I needed to perform gratitude or minimize what I'd accomplished. It was simply recognition, the simple fact of being seen, which I'd learned was distinct from the need to be seen. I could accept it or not, and either way, the work would continue. "Tell them yes," I said. "I'll do it." The mentorship program expanded significantly over the next couple of years. I recruited other women in technical fields, people who understood what it took to build excellence in spaces that hadn't been designed for us. We developed curriculum around leadership and resilience and the particular skill of maintaining focus when the external world wasn't validating what you were doing. The program now has cohorts in 4 different research institutions across California and Nevada, and we've begun to see the results: women advancing into leadership positions, bringing their experiences of perseverance and strategic thinking to bear on problems that mattered. My work at ATRI continued to advance. The propulsion research we'd been conducting began to yield real breakthroughs. A prototype system that would help develop reached a significant milestone, demonstrating capabilities that moved us perceptibly closer to long-range space exploration that had previously been theoretical. The work was still unsexy. The breakthroughs didn't make national news. They weren't the kind of thing that captured the public imagination. But they mattered. They represented a measurable advance in human capability. My family attends the major events now. They came to the conference in Geneva, where I presented our latest findings. They were at the congressional hearing when I testified about the future of aerospace research funding. They've met Daniel and some of my colleagues, and they understand, at least in general outline, what I do and why it matters. My father has become, somewhat to his own surprise, an advocate for federal funding of basic research, using his platform in business circles to argue for the importance of long-term research that doesn't have immediate commercial applications. He was not, I should be clear, transformed into a different person. He was still Thomas Brooks, still the man who had minimized my intelligence to make space for his own relevance, still the man who had looked at his brilliant daughter and decided that her gifts were less real than his own. But he had become aware of that, and he had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to do better. He had become someone who tried. I haven't fully forgiven him. Forgiveness, as I've come to understand it, isn't something you grant all at once and then move past. It's something you practice, regularly, in the small moments when you choose to see someone not as they were but as they're trying to be. And there are still moments when old patterns threaten to reassert themselves. When he speaks about my work in ways that are slightly patronizing, or when he seems to revert to the idea that my achievements are somehow less substantial than what I do simply because they're not the kind of thing that's written about in the newspapers he reads. But those moments are rarer now, and when they happen, I simply correct him. I state the facts. I remind him of what I actually do and why it matters. And he listens, because he's learned that listening is the thing that makes the relationship possible. I don't need his validation to know that my work is real. I've built that understanding from the inside out, reinforced it through years of doing excellent work in spaces where I was the only one who could see the value of what I was creating. But I recognize now that recognition, when it comes from people who love you, changes something. Not the work itself, but your relationship to the work. It becomes not something you're building alone, but something you're building witnessed. And there's a particular kind of ease that comes from being known as you actually are, rather than as you've learned to present yourself to make everyone else comfortable. The blue ribbon from my childhood science fair still sits on a shelf in my office, preserved in its frame, a reminder of that moment when my father looked at me and saw something he recognized. It sits next to photographs from recent conferences, next to framed covers of journals, next to letters from colleagues and mentors. It's not the most important thing on that shelf. But it's there, a kind of anchor point for memory, for the understanding that excellence takes time, that being seen comes not from demanding attention but from building something so real, so undeniable, that invisibility eventually becomes impossible. Worth is not granted. It is built. It is built in laboratories and in research facilities, in meetings where you advocate for your vision, in moments of absolute clarity when you understand that the work matters regardless of whether anyone else recognizes that it does. It is built day after day, choice after choice, decision after decision to remain committed to excellence even when no one is watching, even when the path is long and the end result is uncertain, even when the people who raised you don't understand what you're building or why. That was my inheritance, not the one my father gave me through business acumen or social connections. It was the inheritance I claimed for myself, the understanding that my value is intrinsic, not granted, and that the quiet excellence I built would outlast any recognition that came my way. Everything else, the validation, the applause, the moment when my father finally understood, that was just proof of what I'd always known. That I was real. That I mattered. That I was enough.